The dream always began the same way. A woman with hair the color of autumn oak leaves standing at a rain-streaked window, her hand pressed flat against the glass, whispering his name like a prayer she was afraid to finish. Oliver Maddox woke with a start in the back room of the Tucson livery, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool March night of 1878. He had been having that same dream for 7 years now, ever since a bullet from a Comanchero's rifle had nearly ended his life on the banks of the Pecos River when he still rode for the Texas Rangers. The doctors had said he was lucky to survive the fever that followed. Oliver had always believed it was something else that pulled him back from the edge of that darkness, a woman's voice telling him it was not yet his time, her cool hand against his burning forehead. He had never seen her face clearly, not really, only the impression of it, the shape of full lips and eyes the color of storm clouds over green pasture, and hair that caught firelight like copper. He told no one about the dream anymore. He had once back in Laredo, and the men he rode with had laughed until whiskey came out their noses, calling him a moonstruck fool who ought to find himself a real woman instead of chasing ghosts through his sleep. So he had learned to keep the dream close, a secret pressed against his ribs like a locket he could not open. He rose from the cot, splashed water on his face from the basin, and pulled on his boots. Outside, the desert sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges, the saguaros standing like dark sentinels against the purpling horizon. He had work to do. A telegram had come the evening before summoning him to the office of Nathaniel Whitfield, attorney at law, on Congress Street, and Oliver Maddox did not make a habit of keeping men of business waiting, especially when they paid as well as Whitfield did. Oliver was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of hard riding, with sun-browned skin and pale gray eyes that had seen more violence than any man ought to see, and still somehow managed to look kind when he wanted them to. He had left the Rangers 4 years back after a disagreement with a captain who cared more about politics than justice, and since then he had made his living as a hired escort, a man who moved shipments of gold, important documents, and occasionally important people across the dangerous stretches of Arizona territory where the law was thin, and the land was thick with men who would just as soon shoot you as look at you. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Samson, and rode through the waking streets of Tucson, past adobe storefronts and the smell of wood smoke and frying bacon, until he reached the whitewashed building where Nathaniel Whitfield kept his practice. The lawyer was a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and ink stains on his fingers, and he greeted Oliver with the kind of relief that told Oliver immediately this was not going to be a simple job. "Mr. Maddox," Whitfield said, gesturing to a chair, "thank you for coming so quickly. I have a matter of some urgency, and I am told you are the best man in the territory for this kind of work." "Depends on the work," Oliver said, settling into the chair, his hat resting on his knee. Whitfield folded his hands atop a stack of papers on his desk. "I need you to escort a young woman from the rail depot here in Tucson to the town of Prescott. She arrives on the afternoon train from the east, 3 days from now. The journey by stage and horseback will take the better part of a week, perhaps longer if the weather turns." "Prescott is a fair piece from here," Oliver said. "What makes this particular lady worth the trouble?" Whitfield's expression darkened. "Her name is Caroline Collins. Her late father, Charles Collins, held a legal land grant of some 11,000 acres northwest of Prescott, a cattle ranch with good water and better grazing than any spread in the territory. Mr. Collins passed away this past winter, and by the terms of the original grant and territorial law, his daughter must present herself in person at the land office in Prescott and file her claim of inheritance within 30 days of receiving notice, or the land reverts to unclaimed status and becomes available for purchase by any party who petitions the territorial governor." Oliver's jaw tightened. He had seen this game played before. "And I take it there's a party already interested in petitioning." "Jasper Kane," Whitfield said, as though the name itself tasted bitter. He owns the Circle K spread that borders the Collins Ranch to the south, and he has wanted that water for the better part of a decade. Charles Collins refused to sell, more than once, and refused at gunpoint the last time Kane sent men to persuade him otherwise. I have reason to believe, though I cannot prove it in any court, that Kane had a hand in the accident that took Charles Collins's life. What kind of accident? His wagon went over an embankment on the road from Prescott to Skull Valley. The wheel had been tampered with, according to the blacksmith who inspected it afterward, but the sheriff in Yavapai County is a man who owes Jasper Kane a great many favors, and the matter was never investigated properly. Whitfield removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Miss Collins is alone in the world now, Mr. Maddox. She has no brothers, no husband, no one to stand beside her. If Kane's men can delay her arrival past the 30-day deadline, or worse, prevent her arrival altogether, the ranch will fall into his hands, and I do not believe for one moment that he intends to stop there. I have received word through channels I trust that Kane has already hired men to watch the roads. Oliver felt something settle low in his chest, the old familiar weight of purpose he had not felt since his ranger days. You want me to get her there safely, deadline or no deadline? I want you to get her there alive, Whitfield said quietly. The deadline is 11 days from today. I have already sent word ahead that you will be traveling together, though I confess I know very little about the young woman herself beyond what her father told me in his letters. He spoke of her often. Said she had her mother's stubbornness and her own good sense, which he considered a rare combination in anyone, man or woman. I'll take the job, Oliver said, and he meant it before Whitfield had even finished naming the price, though the price when it came was more than fair. They shook hands, and Oliver rode back toward the depot to make his preparations, never once suspecting that his life was about to be turned inside out by a woman he had never met, in a town he had passed through 100 times without a second thought. The train from the east came in 3 days later, exactly as promised, in a great huffing cloud of steam and cinder smoke that settled over the platform like a gray shroud before the wind carried it off toward the mountains. Oliver stood near the ticket window with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, watching the passengers descend one by one, an elderly couple, a drummer with a case full of sewing notions, 2 soldiers heading to Fort Lowell. And then she stepped down from the car, and the world went very quiet around Oliver Maddox. She wore a traveling dress of deep green wool, practical rather than fashionable, with her copper-colored hair pinned beneath a small hat that had clearly seen a long journey and did not quite manage to hide the way the strands had come loose at her temples. She was perhaps 26 years old, slender but not frail, with a firm set to her shoulders that spoke of a woman used to carrying her own weight in the world. And when she turned her head to search the platform, scanning the faces there, Oliver saw her eyes, gray-green, like storm clouds over pasture grass. His heart seemed to stop beating entirely for the space of 3 full seconds. He had seen those eyes before, 1,000 times in 100 fevered dreams stretching back 7 years. He had seen that exact tilt of the chin, that same soft fullness at her mouth. It was impossible. It was madness. And yet there she stood, not 20 paces away, as real and solid as the platform beneath his boots. "Are you Mr. Maddox?" she asked, and her voice, too, struck something deep in him, a low, warm alto that seemed to unlock a door he had kept sealed for years. He realized he had been staring and forced himself to move, closing the distance between them and removing his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Oliver Maddox. Mr. Whitfield hired me to see you safely to Prescott." "Caroline Collins," she said, extending a gloved hand, and when he took it, even through the thin leather, he felt something pass between them, a current he could not name and would not have believed possible if he had not felt it himself. She seemed to feel it too, for her breath caught just slightly, and her eyes widened as she studied his face with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Have we met before, Mr. Maddox?" she asked slowly. "You will think me foolish for asking, but you seem familiar to me somehow." "No, ma'am," he said, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I don't believe we have." But he did not believe his own words even as he spoke them, and neither, it seemed, did she. They stood there a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, two strangers regarding each other with the wary wonder of people who had stumbled upon something neither of them understood, until the station agent called out that the baggage was ready for collection, and the ordinary business of the world reasserted itself around them. "We should get you settled," Oliver said, clearing his throat and stepping back. "I've arranged a room at the hotel for tonight. We'll leave at first light tomorrow. It's a hard ride to Prescott, Miss Collins, and I won't pretend otherwise. There's men out there who don't want you to arrive at all." Something flickered across her face, fear quickly mastered. "Mr. Whitfield wrote to me of the danger. My father's death was no accident, Mr. Maddox. I intend to prove that in time, but first I must save what he built." "Then we understand each other," Oliver said, and together they walked toward the baggage car, though his mind remained back on the platform, turning over the impossible fact of her face, the face from his dreams, now walking beside him in the dust and sunlight of a Tucson afternoon. That evening, over a simple meal of beef and beans at the small hotel dining room, Oliver found himself watching Caroline Collins with an attention he could not seem to master. She ate with quiet composure, though he noticed the tremor in her hand when she lifted her coffee cup, a tremor that spoke of a woman holding herself together through sheer will. "You lost your father recently," Oliver said, not quite a question. "6 weeks ago." She set down her fork. "I received the letter from Mr. Whitfield only 3 weeks past. I have been traveling ever since, first from Kansas City, where I had been living with my aunt since my mother passed, then by rail across half the continent, it seems, to arrive in a territory I have never seen, to claim a ranch I have never laid eyes upon, from a father I had not seen in person for nearly 10 years. 10 years is a long time," Oliver said. "My parents separated when I was 16. My mother took me east. My father stayed in the territories, chasing his fortune in land and cattle. We wrote letters. That was the whole of our relationship these last years, ink and paper and the occasional photograph." Her voice caught just slightly, and she looked down at her plate. "I never had the chance to tell him I forgave him for leaving us. I never had the chance to see the life he built. And now some man I have never met wants to steal it out from under me before I even arrive." "Not while I'm riding with you," Oliver said, and he was surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. Caroline looked up at him then, and something in her gaze seemed to search his face for a long moment. "You keep looking at me as though you expect me to vanish, Mr. Maddox." He should have laughed it off, made some easy joke to smooth over the strangeness of the moment. Instead, he found himself telling her the truth, or a piece of it at least. "I was shot once," he said slowly, "a long time back down on the Pecos, nearly died of the fever that came after, and while I was somewhere between this world and the next, I dreamed of a woman. I never saw her face clear, not until today on that platform." He shook his head, half expecting her to recoil, to think him mad. "I know how it sounds." But Caroline did not recoil. Instead, her face went pale, and she set down her coffee cup with a small, careful click against the saucer. "When I was 19, she said quietly, "I fell ill with scarlet fever. My mother said I nearly died, that the doctor had given up hope, that I burned with fever for 4 days straight and spoke in my sleep of things I could not have known. I remember, even now, dreaming of a man, wounded, lying in the dust somewhere far from any town, and I remember sitting beside him, though I have never in my life left the state of Missouri before this journey, and telling him it was not yet his time to go." Her hands trembled where they rested on the table. "I told my mother about the dream when I woke. She said I must have imagined it in the fever. I have never spoken of it to another living soul since, because I feared exactly what I fear now, that you will think me touched in the head." Oliver felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "That was 7 years ago," he said. "The Pecos River. I was 25 years old and dying of a bullet wound and fever, and a woman with your eyes sat beside me and told me it was not my time. They stared at each other across the small table, the dining room around them fading into insignificance, the clatter of other diners and the smell of wood smoke and beans forgotten entirely. "I do not understand this," Caroline whispered. "Neither do I," Oliver admitted. "But I know what I've seen, and I know what I've dreamed for 7 years, and I am looking at it right now, sitting across this table from me." Neither of them spoke for a long while after that, the silence between them thick with wonder and a kind of fear neither wanted to name, the fear of something too large and too strange to fit into the ordinary shape of their lives. They left Tucson before dawn the next morning, Oliver on Samson and Caroline mounted on a sure-footed mare he had selected for her from the livery, a sensible dun-colored animal named Biscuit that Caroline took to almost immediately, murmuring soft words to the horse as she settled into the saddle with more competence than Oliver had expected from a woman raised mostly in eastern cities. "My father taught me to ride when I was a girl," she explained when he complimented her seat. "Before my parents separated, he always said a woman who could not ride and shoot was a woman at the mercy of every fool with a gun. I have not forgotten, even after all these years in Kansas City parlors." "You know how to shoot too?" "Well enough," she said, and there was a spark in her eye that Oliver found he liked very much. The road north toward Prescott wound through country that changed by the mile, from the saguaro-studded desert around Tucson to rolling grasslands and then into pine-covered hills as the elevation climbed. They made good time that first day, following the stage road with two other travelers they had fallen in with, a family bound for Wickenburg, though Oliver kept a careful watch on the ridgelines and the brush alongside the trail, his rifle never far from his hand. They spoke as they rode, filling the miles with conversation the way travelers often do, and Oliver learned more about Caroline Collins in those hours than he might have learned in months of ordinary courtship. She told him of her mother, a seamstress who had raised her alone after leaving Charles Collins, of the long hours spent hemming dresses for wealthy Kansas City women, while young Caroline did her lessons by lamplight at the kitchen table. She told him of her mother's death 2 years past from consumption, and the aunt who had taken her in afterward, a stern but not unkind woman who had hoped Caroline might marry a banker's son and settle into a comfortable, unremarkable life. "But you didn't want that," Oliver said. "I did not know what I wanted," Caroline admitted, "until my father's letter came and Mr. Whitfield's letter after it, and I realized that I had spent my whole life waiting for something to happen to me, rather than going out and happening to the world myself." She looked over at him, the sun catching the copper in her hair beneath the brim of her hat. "What of you, Mr. Maddox? What brought a Texas Ranger to hiring himself out as an escort in Arizona territory?" He told her in turn of his own life, the ranch in the Texas Hill Country where he had grown up, the loss of his parents to a cholera outbreak when he was 19, the years riding with the Rangers chasing rustlers and Comancheros across the borderlands, the bullet on the Pecos that had nearly ended him, the disagreement with his captain that had ended his career instead. "Do you regret leaving the Rangers?" she asked. "Some days," he said honestly. "But a man can only serve justice so long as the men above him care about justice too, and my captain cared more about which rancher's cattle he might be paid to overlook. I'd rather hire myself out honest than wear a badge dishonest." "That is a rare quality in a man these days," Caroline said quietly, and Oliver found himself unreasonably pleased by the observation. They made camp that night in a sheltered draw off the main road, the family bound for Wickenburg having turned off earlier that afternoon toward their own destination. Oliver built a small fire, more for cooking than for warmth, since he did not want the light visible for miles across the dark hills, and they ate a simple supper of bacon and hardtack and beans, while the stars came out overhead in numbers that Caroline said she had never seen back east. "It's beautiful," she said softly, tilting her head back to take in the great sweep of the Milky Way arching overhead. "I had no notion the sky could hold so many stars." "Wait until you see it from the ranch," Oliver said. "Whitfield tells me your father's place sits up in the hills north of Prescott, good elevation. The sky up there will take your breath clean away." "I hope I live to see it," Caroline said, and the fear crept back into her voice. Oliver reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, an instinctive gesture he did not fully think through until he had already done it. "You will," he said firmly. "I give you my word, Miss Collins." "I did not survive that bullet on the Picos just to fail you now." She looked down at his hand wrapped around hers, weathered and strong against her smaller fingers, and did not pull away. "You keep speaking as though our lives are bound together by something more than chance, Mr. Maddox." "Maybe they are," he said quietly. "I don't pretend to understand it, Miss Collins, but I do not believe in coincidence enough to think that dream was nothing at all." "Caroline," she said, "if we are going to speak of dreams and fate, I think you had better call me Caroline." "Caroline," he repeated, and the name felt right in his mouth, familiar in a way that no name of a stranger had ever felt before. "Then you'd best call me Oliver." They sat together by the small fire a while longer, hands still loosely joined, speaking of small things now, the shapes of the constellations, the sound of coyotes calling in the far hills, until sleep finally claimed them both. Caroline wrapped in her bedroll on one side of the fire and Oliver on the other, though he did not sleep as deeply as he might have, some part of him remaining alert to the sounds of the night, watching over the woman who had haunted his dreams for 7 long years. Trouble found them on the third day, exactly where Oliver had feared it might, in the narrow stretch of road that wound through Skull Valley before climbing toward Prescott. He had noticed the riders first as a haze of dust on a ridge to the east, 3 men, maybe 4, moving parallel to the road at a distance that suggested they did not want to be seen but were not skilled enough to avoid it entirely. Oliver reined Samson in and studied the ridge for a long moment, his hand drifting to the stock of his rifle where it rested in the saddle scabbard. "What is it?" Caroline asked, drawing Biscuit up alongside him. "We're being watched," Oliver said. "Has been since we crossed the wash back there. Could be nothing. Could be Kane's men." "What do? We keep moving, easy as you please, like we haven't noticed a thing," Oliver said. "There's a way station up ahead, run by an old friend of mine named Holly's Bragg. If we can make it there before dark, we'll have 4 walls and a defensible position instead of open road." They pushed the horses to a faster pace without appearing to hurry, and for a while it seemed the riders on the ridge might simply be cattlemen going about their own business, unconnected to the drama unfolding around Caroline Collins's inheritance. But as the road narrowed to pass between 2 rocky outcroppings, the riders appeared ahead of them instead of behind, 4 men on tired horses, blocking the trail with the casual confidence of men who did not expect resistance. "Afternoon," said the lead rider, a broad man with a drooping mustache and a scar that pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You'd be the folks heading up to Prescott, I expect." "We might be," Oliver said evenly, positioning Samson so that his body partially shielded Caroline from the men's line of sight, his rifle now resting across his saddle in a way that was not quite a threat but was not quite casual either. "Might be we're just travelers minding our own business, same as I'd expect you to be doing." "Now, there's no call to be unfriendly," the lead man said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. "Name's Dutch. Me and the boys work for a man named Kane, and he asked us kindly to see that the lady there doesn't trouble herself with a long trip to Prescott. Says there's been some confusion about a piece of land, and he'd rather settle it peaceable, without the young lady wearing herself out on the trail." "The lady's business is her own," Oliver said, "and I don't recall Mr. Kane's name coming up on the deed she's traveling to file." Dutch's smile faded a fraction. "Wasn't asking your opinion, mister. Wasn't asking hers either, if I'm honest. Mr. Kane's willing to pay the lady fair money for that land, more than it's worth if you ask me, and he'd consider it a kindness if she turned around here and took the next train back east, sparing everybody a good deal of trouble. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be frightened off by 4 men and a threat, Caroline said, and her voice, though it trembled slightly, carried a steel that made Oliver's chest swell with something like pride. You may tell Mr. Kane that I intend to file my claim in Prescott exactly as the law allows, and if he wishes to discuss the matter further, he may do so through my attorney. Dutch's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Oliver thought the situation might tip toward violence right there in the narrow pass, the 4 riders' hands drifting toward their own weapons. But Oliver had spent enough years reading men in tense moments to know that Dutch was not truly prepared to start a gunfight in broad daylight on a public road, not with witnesses possible around any bend, and not without more certain odds than 4 against 2. We'll see how you feel about that in a few more days, Dutch said finally, wheeling his horse aside just enough to open a narrow path along the edge of the trail. Territory's a dangerous place, ma'am. A lot of things can happen to a body between here and Prescott. Rock slides, snake bite, bad water. You take care now. They rode past the 4 men in tense silence. Oliver's rifle never quite pointed at anyone but never quite lowered either, until they had put a quarter-mile of distance behind them, and the road curved away from the outcropping into open country once more. That was not a threat about rock slides, Caroline said, her voice unsteady now that the immediate danger had passed. No, Oliver agreed grimly. It was not. We need to reach Hollies' way station before dark, and after that I think we'd best leave the main road where we can and cut through the hills instead. Slower going, but harder for Kane's men to track, and harder still for them to arrange an ambush somewhere convenient. They reached the way station as the sun was setting behind the western hills, a low adobe structure with a corral and a well, run by a grizzled, one-eyed man named Hollis Bragg, who greeted Oliver with the rough affection of old friends and eyed Caroline with open curiosity. This the Collins girl Whitfield wired me about. Hollis asked once they had seen to the horses and settled inside, a fire crackling in the hearth against the cooling desert night. That's right, Oliver said. We had a visit from some of Kane's men on the road today, fellow called Dutch. Hollis spat into the fire. Dutch Farrell, meanest of Kane's whole outfit, and that's saying something since Kane don't hire gentle men. You watch yourself with that one, Oliver. He's killed at least 2 men that I know of, and got away clean both times on account of the sheriff owing Kane money. We figured as much, Oliver said. I mean to take the back trails from here on, through the hills instead of the main road. Smart, Hollis agreed. It'll add the better part of 2 days to your travel, and Whitfield tells me you've only got 8 left before that filing deadline. Caroline, who had been quiet through this exchange, spoke up. Then we cannot afford 2 extra days, Mr. Bragg. We must find another way. Hollis considered this, scratching at his gray-stubbled chin. There's an old trail through Copper Canyon that the Yavapai used to use, cuts a good day and a half off the back route, comes out just south of Prescott near Granite Creek. Rough going, mind you, narrow in places, and there's a river crossing that can run high this time of year if there's been rain in the mountains. But it's a trail Kane's men don't know, far as I'm aware, on account of it not being used by white folks much since the old conflict settled down some years back. Can you show us where it starts? Oliver asked. I'll do better than that, Hollis said. I'll ride the first stretch with you myself come morning, make sure you find the trailhead proper. After that you'll be on your own, but at least you won't be starting off lost. That night, after Hollis had retired to his own small room off the main building, Oliver and Caroline sat together by the dying fire, the events of the day settling heavy between them. Are you frightened? Oliver asked quietly. Caroline considered the question with the same careful honesty she seemed to bring to everything. Yes, she admitted, but less than I was this morning, strangely enough. I think perhaps it is easier to be brave when you are not facing danger alone. You won't be facing it alone, Oliver said. Not while there's breath in me. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight, her gray-green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "Why does it feel," she said slowly, "as though I have known you my whole life, when in truth we met only 4 days ago?" "I've been asking myself the same question since you stepped off that train," Oliver said. "I don't have an answer for you, Caroline. I only know that when I look at you, something in me settles that has been restless for 7 years, like a door closing on a room I didn't know was still open." "That is a very poetic thing for a Texas Ranger to say," she said, though her voice was soft rather than teasing. "Former Ranger," he corrected, and she smiled, the first full smile he had seen from her since Tucson, and Oliver thought he had never seen anything lovelier in his entire life. They rode out at first light the next morning, Holly's leading them along a game trail that climbed steadily into the hills north of the way station, the pines growing thicker and the air growing cooler as they gained elevation. By mid-morning, Holly's reined in at a rocky notch between 2 hills where a faint trail, barely more than a suggestion of a path, wound down into a canyon thick with cottonwood and willow. "This is where I leave you," Holly said. "Follow the canyon north, keep the creek on your left hand, and you'll come out near Granite Creek in about a day and a half if the weather holds. God keep you both, and good luck to you, Miss Collins." "Thank you, Mr. Bragg," Caroline said. "For everything." Hollis tipped his hat and turned his horse back the way they had come, and Oliver and Caroline rode down into Copper Canyon alone, the walls of red and gray stone rising steep on either side, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling somewhere overhead. The canyon was beautiful in a stark, ancient way, and Caroline seemed to drink in the sight of it, the cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out in pale green against the dark stone, the creek running clear and cold over smooth rocks. "My father must have loved this country," she said. "I begin to understand why he never wanted to leave it, even at the cost of his marriage." "It gets into your blood," Oliver agreed. "I've ridden through half of Texas and most of this territory, and there's something about this high desert country that doesn't let go of a man once it's taken hold." They made good progress through the morning, but by early afternoon, dark clouds began building over the mountains to the north, and Oliver felt a familiar unease settle over him as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped several degrees in the space of an hour. "Storm's coming," he said. "We need to find higher ground before that creek starts to rise. Flash floods move fast through country like this." They pushed the horses harder, but the storm broke before they could clear the narrowest section of the canyon, rain coming down in gray sheets that turned the trail to slick mud within minutes, thunder rolling between the canyon walls with a force that set both horses to nervous sidestepping. "There!" Oliver shouted over the rain, pointing to a shallow cave cut into the canyon wall some 30 feet above the creek bed. "Get up there, quickly." They scrambled up the rocky slope, leading the horses as best they could, and reached the shelter of the cave just as the creek below began to swell visibly, brown floodwater churning where clear water had run only minutes before. Caroline was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, and Oliver saw her shivering as the temperature continued to drop with the coming darkness. "We'll have to wait it out here," he said, already gathering what dry wood he could find at the back of the shallow cave, remnants of old brush that had blown in over the seasons. "I can get a small fire going. It's not much shelter, but it'll keep us out of the worst of it." He worked quickly, striking sparks from his flint and steel until a small flame caught in the kindling, then built it carefully into a modest fire that filled the cave with welcome warmth and flickering light. Caroline sat close to it, wringing water from her hair, and Oliver draped his own dry coat, which he had kept protected in an oilcloth wrap, over her shoulders despite her protests. "You'll freeze," she said. "I've weathered worse," he said. "Besides, I've got Ranger blood in me, remember. We're tougher than we look." She laughed then, a real laugh that warmed something in his chest more thoroughly than the fire ever could, and they sat together in the small cave listening to the storm rage outside, The creek far below now a roaring brown torrent that would not be safely crossed until morning at the earliest. "We'll lose most of a day here," Caroline said, some of her earlier fear returning. "The deadline, Oliver. We've got 6 days left after today," Oliver said. "It's tight, but it's not impossible. Once this storm passes and the creek drops, we can make good time. Don't lose heart now, Caroline. We've come too far for that." She nodded, though he could see the worry still etched in the lines of her face, and without quite deciding to do it, he reached over and took her hand again, the way he had that first night by the fire. "Tell me about your father," he said. "The real man, not just the letters. What do you remember of him from before your parents separated?" Caroline was quiet for a moment, watching the flames. "He used to sing to me," she said finally. "Old songs, ballads mostly, in a voice that was not particularly good but full of feeling. He would carry me on his shoulders when I was very small, out past our house in Missouri to watch the sunset, and he would tell me that someday he was going to find a piece of land so beautiful that the sunset would take my breath away every single evening, and that I would live there and never want to leave." Her voice caught. "I think that piece of land is the one I am riding toward right now, Oliver. I think that ranch is the promise he made me when I was 6 years old, and I mean to see it kept, whatever it costs me." "It won't cost you your life," Oliver said fiercely. "I swear it, Caroline. Not while I'm able to stand between you and harm." She turned to look at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears in the firelight, and something passed between them that neither of them tried to name or resist any longer. Oliver reached up and brushed a strand of damp copper hair back from her face, and Caroline did not pull away, did not look away, only watched him with an openness that undid the last of his restraint. "I have dreamed of this moment for 7 years," he said softly, "without ever understanding what it was I was dreaming of. Now that I'm here, living it, I find I don't have the words I thought I would have." "Then don't use words," Caroline whispered. He kissed her then, gently at first, a question more than a statement, and when she answered by leaning into him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, he deepened the kiss with all the pent-up longing of 7 years spent chasing a face he had never expected to find in the waking world. The storm continued to rage outside the cave, but within its small circle of firelight, Oliver Maddox and Caroline Collins found something that felt, to both of them, very much like coming home. They spent that night in the cave, the fire banked low but steady, Caroline eventually drifting to sleep with her head resting against Oliver's shoulder while he kept watch over her and over the storm, his heart full in a way he had never experienced before, not even in his most vivid dreams. He thought of the years he had spent believing himself a fool for holding onto the memory of a dream, the nights he had wondered if he was losing his mind, chasing a ghost that could never be real. And now here she was, solid and warm against him, breathing softly in her sleep, as real as the stone at his back and the fire before him. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the canyon washed clean and glittering with moisture in the early light. The creek receded enough that they could pick their way carefully across at a shallow ford Oliver located a half-mile downstream. They rode on through the day, in a companionable silence occasionally broken by conversation, the easy talk of two people who had crossed some invisible threshold together, and now moved through the world with a new understanding between them. They emerged from Copper Canyon on the afternoon of the following day, coming out onto a broad, grassy plain with the town of Prescott visible in the distance, its buildings clustered beneath the granite peaks that gave Granite Creek its name. Relief flooded through Oliver at the sight of it, though he knew their troubles were not yet fully behind them. "We've made good time," he said. 4 days left before the deadline. We'll reach Prescott by evening if we keep this pace." But as they crested a low rise perhaps 2 miles outside town, Oliver's relief curdled into fresh alarm. A group of riders waited on the road ahead, 7 or 8 men this time, far more than the 4 who had confronted them at Skull Valley, and at their head sat a heavy-set man in an expensive black coat that seemed entirely out of place amid the dust and scrub of the territory. "That's Jasper Kane himself," Oliver said grimly, reaching for his rifle. He must have grown impatient waiting for Dutch's men to turn you back. What do we do? Caroline asked, her voice steady despite the fear Oliver could see in her eyes. We can't outrun 8 men on tired horses, Oliver said. We'll have to talk our way past or fight our way past if talking fails. Stay close to me, and if shooting starts, get down low and ride for those rocks to the east. Don't look back, don't wait for me, just ride. I will not leave you, Caroline said fiercely. You'll do as I say if it comes to that, Oliver said, though his heart clenched at the thought of her riding away from danger while he faced it alone. I need to know you're safe, Caroline. That matters more to me than anything else in this world. They rode forward slowly, and Jasper Kane walked his horse out to meet them, a smile on his fleshy face that did not reach his cold eyes. Miss Collins, I presume, Kane said, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. And you must be the man my associate Dutch mentioned, the hired gun trying to see the young lady safely to town. I confess I'm impressed you made it this far. Most men would have taken my offer more seriously after that little conversation in Skull Valley. Mr. Kane, Caroline said, her voice cold and controlled. I understand you have some interest in my father's land. Your father's land, Kane repeated, as though the phrase amused him. Your father is dead, Miss Collins, God rest him, and dead men have no more claim on this earth than the dust they return to. That land should be mine by rights. I have irrigated half of it already with water rights I've held for 15 years. Water your father stole from me through a legal technicality no honest judge would have allowed if the territorial courts weren't so easily bought. That is a lie, Caroline said, and I intend to prove it once I have filed my claim properly and can bring the matter before an honest judge. Kane's smile faded. There is no honest judge in this territory who will rule against me, Miss Collins, and I think it is past time you understood that. I am prepared to offer you $8,000 for that land, more money than you have likely seen in your entire life, enough to return to Kansas City and live comfortably for the rest of your days. Take the offer, sign the papers I have waiting in town, and this unpleasantness can end today peacefully for everyone concerned. And if I refuse, Kane's eyes flicked to Oliver, then back to Caroline. Then I am afraid the desert can be a very dangerous place for a young woman traveling without proper protection. Accidents happen. Your father learned that lesson himself, I understand. The words hung in the air like a confession, and Oliver felt his blood go cold with fury. You murdered her father, he said, and now you're threatening to murder her too in front of witnesses on a public road. I have said nothing that could be construed as a threat, Kane said smoothly. I have only observed that the territory is dangerous. Any fool knows that much. Get off this road, Oliver said, his voice low and dangerous, his rifle now resting openly across his saddle horn, hammer drawn back. Miss Collins is riding to Prescott to file her legal claim, and neither you nor your men are going to stop her. Not today, not any day between now and when that claim is filed and recorded. Kane's 8 men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons, and for a long, tense moment it seemed the standoff might explode into gunfire right there on the open road. But Oliver held his ground, his rifle steady, his eyes fixed on Kane with the flat, dangerous calm of a man who had faced down worse odds before and survived. You're 1 man against 8, Maddox, Kane said. Even a fool can do that arithmetic. Maybe so, Oliver said. But I promise you this, Kane. You may kill me here today, but I will take you down with me before I fall, and every man watching this exchange will be witness to murder committed on the open road against an unarmed woman and her escort. That's not the kind of story that stays quiet, not even in a territory where you own the sheriff. Word travels. The territorial governor has his own reasons to want Yavapai County kept peaceable, what with statehood talk always simmering. You want that kind of attention on your operation, Kane. Every land deal you've ever made suddenly under scrutiny. Something in Kane's expression flickered, a calculation working behind his cold eyes, and Oliver pressed his advantage. Let us pass, Oliver continued. Let Miss Collins file her claim, let the courts decide the matter of water rights properly, with lawyers and judges and paperwork, the way civilized men settle disputes. You do that, and there's no story here at all, just a business disagreement resolved through legal channels. But you shoot us down here today, and you've made yourself a murderer in front of 8 witnesses, any one of whom might decide someday that his own conscience or his own advantage is better served by talking to a federal marshal instead of staying loyal to you. The second stretched on, taut as a drawn bowstring, until finally Kane's mouth twisted into something between a snarl and a forced smile. You've got a silver tongue for a hired gun, Maddox. Fine, ride on then, both of you. But mark my words, Miss Collins, this isn't finished. I will see that land in my hands one way or another, through the courts if I must, though I promise you the courts in this territory favor men who have lived here 15 years over women fresh off the train from Kansas City. He wheeled his horse aside, gesturing for his men to clear the road, and Oliver and Caroline rode past them at a careful, deliberate pace, Oliver's rifle never fully lowered until they had put a solid quarter-mile behind them, and the road curved out of sight of Kane and his men. That was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed, Caroline said, once they were safely clear, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. You stood against 8 armed men without so much as a tremor in your voice. I was trembling plenty on the inside, Oliver admitted, but I wasn't about to let that man see it. Men like Kane feed on fear, Caroline. Show him weakness and he'd have shot us both down without a second thought and paid the sheriff to call it self-defense. Do you think he'll try again? I think we need to reach Prescott and get you into Whitfield's care and the protection of witnesses as quickly as possible, Oliver said. Kane's threat about the courts worries me more than his threat of violence, truth be told. A man with money can bend the law in ways a bullet never could. They reached Prescott as the sun was setting behind the granite peaks, the town alive with the ordinary bustle of a territorial settlement, miners and cattlemen crowding the boardwalks, the smell of wood smoke and horse and fried food filling the cooling evening air. Oliver guided them to the office of Josiah Meade, the attorney Whitfield had recommended as trustworthy in Prescott, a wiry, energetic man who greeted them with evident relief. Miss Collins, Mr. Maddox, thank the Lord you've arrived safely. Whitfield's telegram had me half convinced you'd both been waylaid on the road. We very nearly were, Oliver said grimly, and he related the confrontation with Jasper Kane in detail while Meade listened, his expression growing increasingly grave. This is troubling, Meade said when Oliver had finished. Kane has friends in the Territorial Land Office here in Prescott. I won't pretend otherwise. But the deadline for your claim is still 3 days off, Miss Collins, and I believe if we file first thing tomorrow morning, with proper documentation and Mr. Maddox and myself as witnesses to the circumstances of your journey, we can secure your claim before Kane finds any legal maneuver to delay it further. What documentation do you require? Caroline asked. Meade began listing the papers needed. The original grant documents her father had left with Whitfield for safekeeping, her own identification papers proving her relationship to Charles Collins, and a sworn statement regarding the circumstances of her father's death that might, in time, support a criminal investigation into Kane's involvement. They worked late into the evening preparing the necessary papers, and Oliver found lodging for Caroline at a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, insisting on taking a room himself just down the street where he could keep watch on the comings and goings near the boarding house through the night. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and they arrived at the Yavapai County Land Office before it had even properly opened. Meade carrying the precious documents in a leather satchel he did not let out of his sight. The land office clerk, a nervous young man named Prentice, seemed startled by their early arrival but accepted the filing without apparent hesitation, stamping the documents and recording the claim in the county register with what Oliver hoped was genuine indifference to the politics swirling around the transaction. "The claim is officially filed and recorded," Meade announced once they had stepped back out onto the boardwalk, relief evident in his voice. "Miss Collins, the Collins Ranch is legally yours, recognized by the territory of Arizona effective this morning." Caroline let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks, tears springing to her eyes. "It's really done. After everything, it's truly done." "The filing is done," Meade cautioned. "Kane may still attempt to contest the claim through the courts, particularly regarding the water rights dispute he mentioned, but he can no longer simply prevent you from taking legal possession. That much is settled." "Thank you," Caroline said, gripping Meade's hand and then more fervently Oliver's. "Thank you both for everything you have done to bring me safely to this moment." But their relief was short-lived. As they walked back toward the boarding house to gather Caroline's belongings before riding out to see the ranch itself for the first time, a commotion at the edge of the street drew their attention, and Oliver's hand instinctively moved to his revolver as he recognized several of Kane's men positioned near the livery, watching their movements with undisguised interest. "They're not going to simply let this go," Oliver murmured to Caroline. "We need to be careful the next few days, even with the claim filed. A man like Kane doesn't accept defeat easily." His warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. That very evening, as Oliver returned from arranging a wagon and supplies for their journey out to the ranch, he found Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house in an uproar, the widow herself wringing her hands on the front porch. "Mr. Maddox, thank heaven you've come. 2 men came not 20 minutes past, said they had a message from her father's lawyer and needed Miss Collins to come with them right away to sign urgent papers at the land office." She seemed uncertain, but they were quite insistent, said it concerned the validity of her claim, and she went with them before I could think to send word to you. Oliver's blood ran cold. "Which direction did they go?" "Toward the edge of town, out past the livery, I believe, though I confess I did not watch closely." He was back on Sampson within seconds, riding hard toward the edge of Prescott, his mind racing through the implications of what Mrs. Pruitt had described. No legitimate messenger from Meade's office would have come at dusk with such urgency, and no legal matter would require Caroline to leave in the company of strange men rather than simply summoning Meade himself. This was Kane's doing, he was certain of it, an attempt to seize Caroline before her claim could be fully secured, perhaps to force her signature on some fraudulent document under duress, or worse, to remove her from the picture entirely and claim the land reverted due to her absence. He found Josiah Meade at his office still working by lamplight and quickly explained the situation. Meade's face went pale. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles north of town that Kane uses for some of his less legitimate business dealings," Meade said. "If his men have taken her anywhere, my guess would be there. I'll ride for the sheriff, though I confess I do not trust him overmuch, and I'll send word to the territorial marshal's office as well, in case this matter requires attention beyond what our local sheriff is willing to provide." "There's no time to wait for marshals riding in from elsewhere," Oliver said. "I'm going after her now. Alone, against however many men Kane has posted there." "I've faced worse odds," Oliver said, though his heart hammered with a fear more intense than any he had felt facing down Kane's 8 riders on the road. This was not merely a matter of professional duty now, not merely the job Whitfield had hired him to complete. Caroline Collins was the woman who had haunted his dreams for 7 years, the woman he had come to love with a fierceness that surprised him with its intensity, and the thought of her in danger, frightened and alone in the hands of Kane's men, drove every other consideration from his mind. He rode north through the gathering darkness, following directions Meade had provided, until he spotted the faint glow of lamplight through the trees ahead, a rough-lined shack set back from a narrow track, 2 horses tied outside that he did not recognize. Oliver approached on foot, leaving Sampson tied a good distance back in the trees, moving with the careful, silent tread the rangers had taught him years before. He crept close enough to the shack to hear voices through the thin wooden walls, and his blood boiled at the sound of Caroline's voice, tight with fear but still defiant. "I will sign nothing under duress," she was saying. "My claim is already filed and legally recorded. Nothing you force me to sign here tonight will hold any weight in a court of law, and you know that as well as I do." "Maybe so," came a rough voice Oliver recognized as Dutch Farrell's, "but a woman who's disappeared can't very well contest anything in any court, now can she? Mr. Kane figures if you're not around to defend that claim, and no body's ever found, well, that's a legal tangle that could take years to sort out, years during which the land just sits there unused. And maybe Mr. Kane finds a way to lease the grazing rights in the meantime, all perfectly legal-like." Oliver's stomach dropped at the implication in Dutch's words. This was no longer a negotiation. This was a kidnapping intended to end in murder. He circled the shack quickly, counting 2 horses outside, and through a gap in the shutters, only 2 men visible inside besides Caroline herself, Dutch Farrell and one other man he didn't recognize, both armed, Caroline seated in a rough chair with her hands bound in front of her. 2 against 1 were odds Oliver could work with, especially with the element of surprise on his side. He moved to the door, drew his revolver, and kicked it open in one swift motion. "Let her go, Dutch," he said, his voice cold and steady despite the pounding of his heart. "This ends now, one way or another." Dutch spun, reaching for his own weapon, but Oliver was faster, years of training and hard experience guiding his hand as he fired a single shot that struck Dutch's gun arm before the outlaw could clear leather, the weapon clattering from his suddenly useless fingers. The second man froze, hands raised, apparently having less appetite for violence than his wounded companion. "Oliver," Caroline cried out, relief flooding her voice. "Are you hurt?" Oliver asked, moving quickly to cut the ropes binding her wrists while keeping his revolver trained on the 2 men, Dutch now clutching his bleeding arm and cursing under his breath. "No, I'm unharmed," Caroline said, though her voice shook as the adrenaline of the ordeal began to fade. "They came to Mrs. Prout's saying you had sent for me, that there was trouble with the claim, and I foolishly believed them." "It's not your fault," Oliver said, helping her to her feet. "Kane's men are practiced liars. This is on them, not on you." He marched the 2 men outside at gunpoint, tying them securely to a porch post with rope he found inside the shack, Dutch's wound bound roughly to stop the bleeding despite Oliver's lack of sympathy for the man's suffering. "Kane will hear about this," Dutch spat. "You've made an enemy tonight, Maddox, one that won't forget." "Kane already made himself my enemy the moment he threatened Miss Collins on the open road," Oliver replied. "Tell him the sheriff and the territorial marshal are both being informed of tonight's events, along with a sworn statement from Miss Collins about what you said in there regarding Mr. Kane's intentions. Kidnapping and conspiracy to murder are serious charges, Dutch, even in a territory where Kane thinks his money buys him immunity." They rode back to Prescott together as the moon rose over the pine-covered hills, Caroline sitting close beside Oliver on Samson's broad back, having left her own horse tied at Mrs. Prout's earlier, her body still trembling from the ordeal but her hand tight and warm in his. "You saved my life," she said softly against his shoulder. "You saved mine, 7 years ago, in a fever dream neither of us understood," Oliver replied. "I'd say we're square, though I intend to keep saving you as many times as it takes, for as long as you'll let me." "And how long is that, do you suppose?" Caroline asked, a smile finally returning to her voice despite everything they had endured. "I was thinking the rest of our lives might be a fair start," Oliver said, and felt her arms tighten around his waist in answer. The following days brought a swift and satisfying resolution to the danger that had shadowed Caroline's journey. The territorial marshal, a serious man named Wade Carlson, who had ridden in response to Meade's urgent telegram, took Caroline's sworn statement along with corroborating testimony from Oliver, and even, reluctantly, from the second kidnapper, who proved far less loyal to Kane than Dutch once faced with the possibility of hanging for his part in the scheme. Faced with mounting evidence and the marshal's evident determination to see justice, done regardless of Kane's local influence, the wealthy cattle baron found his careful arrangements with the county sheriff insufficient protection against federal territorial law. Jasper Kane was arrested within the week on charges of conspiracy to kidnap, and, pending further investigation, suspected involvement in the death of Charles Collins the previous winter. The blacksmith's original testimony about the tampered wagon wheel finally receiving the serious attention it had always deserved. The Circle K Ranch, it emerged during the investigation, had been built on a foundation of similarly coercive tactics against other smaller landholders in the valley, and Kane's arrest brought a measure of relief and justice to more families than just Caroline's own, several of whom came forward once they saw that the law might finally hold Kane accountable for years of quiet tyranny. With the immediate danger resolved, Oliver and Caroline finally made the journey out to the Collins Ranch itself, riding together through rolling grassland studded with juniper and pine, until they crested a final rise and the ranch came into view below them. A modest but solid ranch house of hewn logs, a good barn, corrals, and beyond it all, the silver ribbon of a year-round creek winding through pastures thick with new spring grass. Caroline reined in her horse and simply looked, tears streaming freely down her face as she took in the sight of the place her father had built, the promise he had made her so many years before finally kept, even if he had not lived to see her arrive. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Oliver, it's more beautiful than I ever imagined." "Your father built something worth fighting for," Oliver said quietly, reaching over to take her hand. "I only wish he could have lived to see you standing here claiming it." "He would have loved you," Caroline said suddenly, turning to look at him. "I know it somehow, the same way I knew your face from my dreams before I ever met you in this life. He would have seen the kind of man you are and known you were worthy of trust." They rode down to the ranch house together and spent the remainder of that day exploring the property, finding evidence everywhere of Charles Collins's careful work, well-maintained fences, a thriving vegetable garden gone slightly wild in his absence, but clearly tended with love, a small library of books in the ranch house that spoke of a man who valued learning even in this rough frontier country. In a small writing desk in the main bedroom, Caroline found a stack of letters her father had never sent, addressed to her, filled with the small daily observations of ranch life he had wanted to share with the daughter he had not seen in 10 years, along with repeated expressions of hope that someday circumstances might allow them to reconcile properly. Caroline read the letters that evening by lamplight while Oliver saw to the horses and checked the perimeter of the property out of old habit, and when he returned to find her, she was crying softly over the papers spread across the kitchen table. "He never stopped loving me," she said, when Oliver knelt beside her chair. "Even after all those years apart, he never stopped thinking of me, planning for the day we might be reunited. I only wish I had come sooner, while he was still alive to see it." "He knew you were coming," Oliver said gently. "Whitfield told me your father spoke of you often in his final months, that he had been making arrangements for your inheritance for some time before his death, hoping to bring you west permanently." In his own way, Caroline, I believe he died knowing that reunion was finally within reach. She leaned into Oliver's embrace, and he held her while she wept, grief and joy tangled together in a way that only those who have lost someone dearly loved can fully understand, and when her tears finally subsided, she looked up at him with an expression of such tender gratitude that Oliver felt his own heart nearly break with the fullness of his love for her. "Stay," she said suddenly. "Not just tonight, Oliver. Stay here with me for good. I know it is perhaps too soon to speak of such things, that we have known each other properly for barely 2 weeks, however strange and wonderful those 2 weeks have been. But I cannot imagine building a life on this land without you beside me, and I have come to believe that whatever brought us together in those dreams so many years ago meant for us to find each other in truth eventually, exactly as we have. Caroline Collins, Oliver said softly, taking both her hands in his. I have dreamed of you for 7 years without knowing your name or your face clearly, only the certainty that somewhere in this world, a woman existed who was meant for me, who called to something deep in my soul even across the distance of years and miles. I do not need more time to know what I feel for you. I have already spent 7 years falling in love with you, long before I ever laid eyes on you in truth. I would be honored, more than honored, to stay here and build a life with you if you will have me as your husband. Yes, Caroline breathed, before he had even fully finished the question, and then again more firmly, yes, Oliver, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her then, in the warm lamplight of the kitchen her father had built with his own hands, surrounded by the letters that spoke of hope never abandoned even across years of separation. And Oliver Maddox felt the last piece of some long, unnamed emptiness in his chest finally settle into place. They were married 3 weeks later in the small Presbyterian church in Prescott, with Josiah Meade standing as witness alongside Hollis Bragg, who had ridden in from his way station specially for the occasion, and Mrs. Prout, who had grown genuinely fond of Caroline during her stay at the boarding house and wept openly through the entire ceremony. Nathaniel Whitfield traveled up from Tucson as well, declaring that he could not possibly miss the wedding of the young woman whose case had provided, in his words, the most satisfying professional victory of his entire legal career. Caroline wore a simple dress of pale blue that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her by Mrs. Prout's own capable hands, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the hills around the ranch, columbine and Indian paintbrush, and delicate sprays of penstemon. Oliver stood at the front of the small church in his best clothes, a new coat purchased for the occasion, and when Caroline walked down the short aisle toward him, he felt again that same overwhelming sense of recognition that had struck him on the train platform in Tucson, the certainty that he was looking at the other half of his own soul finally made whole. Do you, Oliver Maddox, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The minister intoned, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, forsaking all others so long as you both shall live. I do, Oliver said, his voice steady and sure. I have in truth for 7 years already, long before I knew her name. The small congregation chuckled softly at this, and Caroline smiled through happy tears as the minister turned to her and repeated the vows, her own answer just as certain and just as sure. They settled into life on the Collins Ranch, which they soon began calling simply the Maddox Place, though Caroline insisted on preserving her father's original brand, and much of the ranch's established operations as a tribute to the man who had built it, all with such patient hope. Oliver's years of hard-won experience proved invaluable in managing the practical challenges of ranch life, while Caroline's education and quiet determination helped them navigate the business affairs and eventual expansion of the property as their herds grew over the following seasons. Jasper Kane was tried the following autumn in the territorial court in Prescott, and though the murder charges related to Charles Collins's death proved difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt given the passage of time and destroyed evidence, the conspiracy and kidnapping charges held firm, resulting in a sentence of 15 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. His Circle K ranch was subsequently sold at auction to settle debts and legal judgments. Much of the water rights dispute resolved in favor of the smaller ranchers who had suffered under Kane's coercive practices for years, a small measure of justice that rippled outward through the whole valley and brought a measure of peace to a community long shadowed by one man's greed. The years that followed brought their own share of hardship, as ranch life in the territory always did, dry seasons that tested the limits of their water rights, harsh winters that claimed cattle despite their best efforts, the ordinary struggles of building a life on the frontier. But Oliver and Caroline faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing season, their love deepening in the way that only shared hardship and shared triumph can forge between two people truly committed to one another. Their first child, a son they named Charles after Caroline's father, was born in the spring of 1880, arriving during a gentle rain that Caroline insisted was her father's blessing on the child, a sign that his spirit remained connected to the land and the family he had never lived to fully know. Oliver held his newborn son that evening on the porch of the ranch house, looking out over pastures now green with spring grass and dotted with their growing herd, and felt a contentment so complete it nearly overwhelmed him. A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Elizabeth after Caroline's mother, a bright and spirited child who took to riding almost before she could properly walk, much to her father's delighted pride and her mother's occasional exasperation. A second son, Samuel, arrived 3 years after that, named for no particular relative but simply because both Oliver and Caroline had always liked the name, and the ranch house that had once held only the quiet solitude of Charles Collins's final years now rang with the laughter and occasional squabbling of 3 growing children. Oliver never fully explained to his children, when they were young, the strange circumstances that had first brought their parents together, the dreams that had haunted him for 7 years before he ever laid eyes on their mother in the flesh. But as they grew older, and particularly as his daughter Elizabeth grew into a thoughtful young woman with her mother's same searching gray-green eyes, he found himself telling the story more fully, the dream of the woman at the window, the fever on the Pecos River, the impossible recognition on that train platform in Tucson so many years before. "Do you truly believe it was fate, Papa?" Elizabeth asked him once, when she was perhaps 16 years old, the two of them sitting together on the porch in the golden light of an autumn evening, while Caroline worked in her garden nearby, her hair now touched with silver but her eyes as bright and lovely as ever. Oliver considered the question with the same careful honesty he had always tried to bring to his children's inquiries. "I believe," he said slowly, "that some connections between people run deeper than we can fully understand or explain, deeper than chance or coincidence alone can account for. I do not know why I dreamed of your mother for 7 years before ever meeting her, or why she dreamed of me during her own illness all those years before we met. But I know that when I finally saw her standing on that platform, something in me that had been searching, restless and unsettled for years, finally found what it was looking for. Call it fate if you like, Elizabeth, or call it simply the great good fortune of two hearts finding each other across all the obstacles this world can throw in the way. Either way, I have never for one single day regretted the path that led me to your mother, nor would I trade a moment of the danger and difficulty of that journey, for it brought me the greatest happiness I have ever known." Caroline, overhearing this from the garden, walked over to join them on the porch, settling beside Oliver with the easy familiarity of nearly 2 decades of marriage, and took his weathered hand in hers just as she had that first night by the campfire so long ago. "Your father is being modest," she said to Elizabeth, smiling. "He faced down Jasper Kane and 8 armed men on the open road to protect me, rescued me from kidnappers with nothing but his wits and his revolver, and somehow still found time to fall in love with me along the way, though I suspect, given the dreams, he had already been in love with me for years before we ever properly met." "It does sound like something out of a storybook," Elizabeth said, laughing. "The best true stories often do," Caroline replied, leaning her head against Oliver's shoulder as the sun continued its slow descent behind the granite peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold above the ranch that had been her father's dream, and had become, through love and courage and no small amount of danger survived together, the foundation of a family that Charles Collins would have been proud beyond words to see flourishing on the land he had once cherished. The ranch prospered over the years that followed, growing into one of the most respected cattle operations in Yavapai County, known not only for the quality of its herds, but for the fairness and honesty with which Oliver and Caroline Maddox conducted their business, a stark and welcome contrast to the corrupt practices that had once threatened to steal it all away. Their children grew into adulthood, Charles eventually taking over much of the day-to-day ranch management himself, Elizabeth marrying a young doctor who established a practice in Prescott, and Samuel pursuing his own ambitions as a territorial surveyor, mapping the very hills and canyons his parents had once traversed together in danger and in growing love. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done, and the vast Arizona sky filled with stars beyond counting, Oliver Maddox and Caroline Collins Maddox would often sit together on the porch of the home they had built, hands joined as they had first joined them on a starlit night so many years before, marveling still at the strange and wondrous path that had led two strangers who were never truly strangers at all to find each other across the miles and years. Bound together by dreams neither of them had ever fully understood, but which had proven in the end more true and more lasting than either of them could have imagined on that first fateful day, when Oliver Maddox stepped forward on a Tucson train platform and found himself looking at last into the eyes that had haunted his dreams for 7 long years.